was U.S. versus Nixon.
About which ones we?
It was U.S. versus Nixon. That was the last thing.
We talked about Plessy versus.
Yeah, that was that because I'm thinking about. Hold on a second. Okay. Oh crap. Okay. This is stuff we talked about when we were here last Thursday.
Yeah, we did.
Okay.
We got there.
All right. Okay. Okay. So, hold on a second. Let me go back.
Yeah, we talked about that.
Okay. We talked about that.
Yep,
Talked
Yep.
about that. Colonization Society.
yep, we got
We
through
talked about
that.
all that. Okay. And the last thing should have been Plessy.
Yes,
Okay.
Never mind.
Okay, that's going to be at the end of the 1800s. Remember Plessy versus, it's important, guys, because it's going to legalize segregation and discrimination. Okay, separate but equal. Okay, new century. New century, okay? First of all, and we didn't talk about the Niagara movement much in class, but this is W.B. Du Bois, all right? The Niagara movement is going to be the first organized group of people dedicated to civil rights, okay? They will later morph over to something called the NAACP. I think I got that on here. Yeah, right there. Okay. So that's important. What Du Bois is doing is he's saying, okay, one problem we have as African Americans is we know we need civil rights, and we know that the attitude of white people is not favorable to us. Okay, so there's strength in numbers, pretty much. So we get everybody together and we have an advocating group, a group that can advocate for African American rights and things, and that's called the Niagara Movement. Okay, later on it will morph over to the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. Okay, they are the largest and oldest and most famous of all the civil rights organizations. Okay, and of course they're still with us today. Right? So Du Bois is going to be the one who's going to say, okay, we need to get together in groups as a number of people and not fight individually. Okay? Okay. Guys, when you talk about the civil rights movement, what are blacks fighting? You have to think about it. I mean, it's a very multi-level thing here. They're fighting discrimination. They're fighting racism. Okay? But they're fighting years and years and years of an ingrained social status. In 1619, when they got off the boat in Jamestown, they were slaves. Okay? They stayed slaves until 1866. Okay? And even though they were freed in the minds of the people that lived around them, they were still slaves, second-class citizens, black codes, Jim Crow laws. They had battled that same mentality over and over and over and over, and nothing had worked. That's what's important here. There are no gains for African Americans here. The only gains they got were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, pretty much. Plessy versus Ferguson was a step back. It legalized segregation, okay? So what's happening is all these years are going by, they're having a problem coming together and being a solid group. That's why this is important, okay? But one thing about the civil rights movement that's important to understand is how long these people have been waiting for some type of improvement to be made in their lives, okay? When we look at the civil rights movement, we start looking at Rosa Parks, okay, the Montgomery bus boycott, things like that. But guys, that's the 1950s. And they first set foot in Virginia in 1619. That's a long time to develop that type of social precedent there. And that's what they're fighting. Years and years and years of second-class citizenhood. Those are important things to keep in mind when you do an essay, because the civil rights movement, if you measure it against the span of history, is relatively young. It's relatively a recent thing. Okay, is everybody with me so far? Okay. Birth of a Nation. This is one of the iconic moments in cinematic history. Right? It was one of the first moving pictures. In other words, when you saw the screen, things were moving. Okay? It was a silent film. Okay? But the problem was, Birth of a Nation refers to Reconstruction. All right? It's a movie about Reconstruction. It is a Southerner's view of Reconstruction. And when this movie was made, D.W. Griffith made this movie, and the reason it was so stunning and accepted was not the subject matter, it was the fact that it was a moving picture. But Woodrow Wilson saw it. Okay, Woodrow Wilson for Virginia, an unreconstructed Southerner. Okay, he sat here and screened this thing in the White House. It is probably, without a doubt, the single most racist film of all time. Okay, remember, guys, racism racism spans the ages like everything else, okay? It was more acceptable back in 1915 because everybody had those ideas about black people. It is a Southern perspective of Reconstruction, and in there you see things that are, and it's weird because when you watch this thing, you're torn between laughing at it and torn between being offended by it, okay? And the reason is it's horribly offensive. It's got every stereotype you can imagine. There are white actors playing blacks in this thing, okay? They're all in blackface, all right? And they all have kinky curly hair. It's embarrassing. And when they showed the South Carolina legislature after a result of military reconstruction, you've got the legislature filled with black people. And they're sitting back in overalls and they're eating fried chicken and eating watermelon. All these stereotypes are perpetuated. And that was what was in this movie. Okay, so it perpetuates a stereotype, okay? The fact that Woodrow Wilson screened it in the White House is more testament to his racism than it was to America's racism, okay? The thing that makes Birth of a Nation disturbing is it portrays the United States as being in the grips of runaway former slaves, okay? It's got very disturbing images of these former slaves chasing white women and things like that, every vulgar thing you can think of. And the only thing that can save the day are the Klan. The Klan is the hero. Okay, they're the ones that come riding in, things like that. And probably the most disturbing scene in the whole thing is at the end of it, there was a horde of black people that had captured this white woman. Okay, and guys, it's a silent movie, but the music is very ominous and things like this. And the Klan guy rides in and saves her, rides off into the sunset. And the last scene, this guy, the Klan guy and his girl are standing on a cliff overlooking the sea. And they're sitting here, and the wind's blowing in their hair. And in the background, a picture of Jesus Christ rises above. It's one of the most disturbing things you can think of from our perspective, okay? But Birth of a Nation is going to be an indicator of the racism of the time. D.W. Griffith had no problems whatsoever putting this on screen in a movie he knew would be a historical landmark, okay? I used to show it to my classes, okay, just to get an idea of it. And nobody ever complained. It just offended me. And the reason is because I would show this thing, and I had black students, and I would watch them, and they just thought it was pretty funny. But I thought to myself, this is not right. I mean, I'm showing this, and if they're offended, they're such good kids, they would never tell me. And it was offending me because I was insulting my students and things. So I don't show it anymore, okay? You can Google it if you want to watch it. It's pretty much comical, to be honest with you, because it's so far out there, you know, that there's no way you can take it serious. But when you screen this thing in the White House, and Woodrow Wilson says the greatest film I've ever seen, okay, that lies testament to the level of racism. It's systematic, okay? Great Migration. Ever since Reconstruction, African Americans have been wanting to leave the South. God, who can blame them? Okay? They've been slaves all these years, Reconstruction, now Jim Crow, you got the Klan everywhere, you got people being lynched and things like this. You can't go vote, you can't practice your constitutional rights because home rule's back in the South, so people try to leave, okay? Remember we talked about earlier on that if you're black in the South after Reconstruction, you can't go north, okay? Because immigrant labor doesn't want you competing for those jobs. There was violence in the North because of that, okay? You're stuck in the South, okay? But some went west. Remember the Exodusters. They went west to Kansas, things like this, okay? When World War I is going on, there's a labor shortage in the North because the boys are all fighting the war, okay? Some of these jobs will be filled by women, okay? But a lot of them will be filled by African Americans. A huge migration will take place in the South. They'll move north, and they'll move to industrial cities, Detroit, Chicago, places like this, New York. And when they get there, they're there to stay, okay? So they're going to be just like any other immigrant. When an immigrant comes from Italy and lands in New York City, the first thing they do, they head straight to Little Italy, okay? Because that's where their culture is. That's where people who are like them. African Americans will do this, but there are no ethnic neighborhoods, so they'll build them. The most famous of these, of course, is Harlem. So when they move north like this, they will form communities that are just like they are, where they'll feel comfortable, okay? The Great Migration is going to result in something called the Harlem Renaissance. And this is when African Americans finally come north and they establish their culture. Guys, that's important. When you establish your culture, that's something you can live in and you can thrive in. It's not like you're sitting back and looking at it. So the Great Migration is going to bring African Americans to the north from the south. Most of them will stay there after the war. Okay, some won't. But this is going to be a massive migration. And guys, it's something that blacks have been wanting to do for years and years and years. Get out of the South. If you're in the South, you're a sharecropper. You're a tenant farmer. If you come to Harlem or Detroit, you might find a job doing something else. Most did, okay? So this is a huge demographic movement, okay? Everybody good so far? All right? Okay. The Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s, you saw that question on the test. This is an expression of African culture, African American culture. Music, some of the greatest music ever written. This is where jazz, Duke Ellington, people like this. Literature. Okay? This is all a flowering of this. African Americans finally have a place where they can expand their culture and society and not get punished for it. Okay? The issue with the new Negro, all right, this has to do with, let's see who's on here next. Yeah, him. Okay? Marcus Garvey is a huge figure in the civil rights movement. Okay? The reason is Garvey was the first one to say, why are you ashamed of being black? When he ran across black people from the South, it's almost like they were apologetic. They had been subservient to white people for so long, that's all they knew. Okay? And Garvey would say, why? Why are you like that? Why are you ashamed of being black? Okay? There's nothing, we have a very pure, racial, deep legacy that we should celebrate. Okay? So this is going to be called, this is the new Negro. The new Negro is one that's proud of being black. They're embracing their African heritage. It'll happen again in the 1960s. Okay? Garvey believed in black nationalism, is looking at blacks as a member of a nation. Okay? He went further by forming the Back to Africa movement. Okay? This is picking up a little bit on colonization. And what he's saying is this: as long as you live in the United States, you will be a second-class citizen because you're black. Your heritage here is that of a slave. Your heritage in Africa is of a kingdom, of your culture. So if you don't want to stay in America and have to fight to practice your legacy, go back to Africa. And a lot did. Okay? They embraced their African nationalism and they went back to Africa. Okay? Is everybody good so far? Okay. Oops. Okay. Everybody got that? Okay. Marcus Garvey's attitudes, okay, will come back in the 1960s. You'll see another black nationalism. These folks, however, will not be going back to Africa. Okay, they'll start adopting African dress, African names, and things like this because they want to embrace their black heritage in ways other than leaving the country and going back to Africa. There will be one group that will call on the United States to carve out of California a black state, from Oakland down to just north of Los Angeles. Okay, we'll talk about that probably on Friday.